So let's now send a request once the form is submitted. Now this checkout component is already a pretty full component with a lot of code in there, and therefore I'll not add the request logic in there, but instead I want to kind of submit or send the submitted data back to the cart, where we then also have the cart data, which is good because we need that to send it to the server, to then send both the cart data, so the items in the cart, as well as the submitted user data to the server. Now, one important word here. On a server, you should typically never trust the data you get from a client, because validation as we built it here can always be circumvented. For example, I, as a visitor, could edit the loaded JavaScript code. It's not hidden from me, I can edit it. Attached you find an article and a video with more information on that. Therefore, you typically always want to validate incoming data on the server as well. Now here, we only have a dummy backend with Firebase, and whilst we could actually also add some server-side logic to that, that's simply not the focus of this course, since this course is about React, which is a client-side library. If you want to dive into server-side code, server-side validation, writing your own server-side code, I of course also got courses on this, for example my Node.js course. But that's just a side note, I just wanted to emphasize that you should not trust client-side data like this. You, for example, typically also would want to validate those submitted cart item prices with actual database data on the server. It's not something we do here, but I want to make you aware of that. So therefore, it's the cart component where that data should be submitted to the server. And for this, I'll add a new function in that cart component. Submit order handler, that could be the name of that function. And in here, I expect to get the user data as an argument, as a parameter. We already get access to the cart data through the cart context, so that won't be a problem. And therefore, all we now gotta do is make sure that this submit order function is called from inside the checkout component and that it receives that user data. So for that, I'll pass it to the checkout component through a prop. Let's say the on submit or on confirm prop. Up to you, it's your component, where I point at the submit order handler. So on confirm is the prop name, hence in checkout, in this confirm handler. Once we validated everything down here, we now want to call props.onConfirm. So that prop name we're expecting here in the cart component. We want to call props.onConfirm and now forward that user data, which should be an object because I'm not expecting multiple arguments for the name, street, city, and so on, but I am expecting just one argument here, the collected user data. So let's group that user data into an object here, where we set the name equal to the entered name, not the validity, but just the name. Set a street field to the entered street, set the city field to the entered city, and set the postal code to the entered postal code like this. And with that, we pass the data from the checkout component to the cart component. In there, we now want to send the request to the backend, and we want to send both the user data as well as the cart data. Now for this, we can again use the fetch function and send a request to Firebase. So to our Firebase URL here, and then to a new node of our choice, for example, orders.json. You don't need to create it in advance, it will be created dynamically. And the important thing now is that this should be a post request. So we need to pass this configuration object as a second argument to fetch and set method to post. We then also need to add the body and set this to JSON stringify, since we need to send JSON data, and pass in all our data. And that's an object with the user data. So here we could set a user field and pass the user data we're getting here as a value for that field. And then maybe add a ordered items field. And that should then be our cart. Now for this, we have our cart context where we get our items. So we can then set cart context items as a value for the ordered items. And that's the data we're then sending to the backend. Now, just like this, without anything else, it should already work. We're not handling the response yet, we're not handling errors or anything like that, but we are sending a post request. So this should already work. If we save that, and I do have some data entered here, I do have some cart data, and I click confirm, that should have worked. And indeed, if we check the Firebase console, you should see an orders node now with a new auto-generated ID for this newly added item. And then in there we have user with the user data we entered and ordered items with the cart data we submitted. So that is working. If it's not working, definitely double check your code, compare it to mine, because that should now be working. Now, therefore, as a last step, I of course want to change the user experience a little bit. I want to clear what we see on the screen here if we clicked confirm and show a loading spinner and then a success message if the cart was submitted. And of course, the cart should then also be cleared thereafter. So let's handle this submission state. And for this, we need use state and then manage a new piece of state here in the cart component. And that is the is submitting state and set is submitting. And initially that's false. But I want to set it to true as soon as the submit order handler gets called. So here I'll set is submitting to true. Then I want to wait for this fetch function to finish, and for this we can await this and turn this into an async function. Here we have no problem with that because this is not an effect function, but instead this is a regular function which gets triggered when we submit the form. So here we then await and we get back our response, and we could now use the response to check the status code and potentially throw an error, which we then would have to handle, to also show an error message. I will not do that here to keep this a bit shorter, and instead I'll assume that it always works. In reality, of course, and maybe as an extra practice, you might want to implement error handling as well, just as we did it a couple of minutes ago with the other fetch request for loading the meals, or in the HTTP module. Here, to save some time, I will not implement it. Instead, we submit this, or we set is submitting, then we await this, and therefore once this request is done and we got a response, we can set is submitting back to false. But now I want to make sure that we show some success message. And therefore I'll add another state, the did submit state, and set did submit. And initially that's also false, but this should be set to true as soon as we did submit our data. So here we can then set did submit to true once we're done sending that request. And now we can work with these two states in our component. To be precise, I want to swap the entire content of the modal when we're submitting and once we did submit. So I'll add a new constant which I'll name cart modal content. And in there, I'll store all that code here. Now, since I now have multiple sibling items here inside of that constant, I need to wrap that with react.fragment. So we want to wrap this because, as you learned, sibling JSX code is not allowed. And for this, of course, we need to import React from React. With that, we can wrap that all with a fragment, and now we got the cart modal content, which I normally want to render here, like this. But I'll now define another constant, the isSubmitting modal content, and that's the content that should be shown if we are currently submitting. And here I'll just add a paragraph where I say sending order data. Now that should be shown if we are submitting. Therefore, I only want to show the cart modal content if we're not submitting, hence the exclamation mark. If we are submitting, I want to show the isSubmitting modal content. Now last but not least, we can of course also be done with submitting. So I'll add another constant, didSubmit modal content, and that's another paragraph where I say successfully sent the order. And we could of course then also say something like you will be contacted once we're done preparing your order or anything like that. Here I'll just say successfully sent the order, and that should be showing up if we did submit. Then the didSubmit modal content should be rendered. And therefore we should also tweak these two lines and only show the cart modal content if we're not submitting and we did not submit yet. Did submit like this. So if not submitting and not did submit, then show the cart modal content. I always want to show the isSubmitting modal content if we are submitting. But otherwise, if we did submit, I want to show the didSubmit modal content, maybe if we are not currently submitting. Though in this app, we can't really be submitting and have submitted already. Nonetheless, having this extra check also won't hurt. I hope this logic is clear. With that in place, if we now save this, we got our cart here. If I click order, I now need to fill in my data, otherwise I get errors. So let's enter something here. And if I now click confirm, watch closely, we see our two other states. isSubmitting and now the successfully sent the order state. And of course we can now still close the modal by clicking somewhere else. We can of course also add a new button to the modal here if we want to. We can wrap this here into a fragment as well, so that we can have two sibling components, the paragraph, and then next to that, for example, a button. So here we could grab our modal actions div and insert this next to this paragraph, get rid of that order button and just keep the close button, and give this a class of button instead of button alt. And on click, this will then close the modal. So if we now save this, if I again order this, enter some data here, whoops, max and test street, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and test. Now I can close this with this button. So now we're showing these different states. Now, as a last step, I want to clear the cart once we did submit, because currently it's never cleared. Our items stay in the cart. So to clear that cart, we need to go to our cart context, to the cart provider to be precise, and there we'll need a new action. We do have actions for adding and removing single items, but now we need an action to clear the entire cart. So I'll add a new if check in this reducer here, which we added here in this cart reducer, and check for action.type being equal to clear. And if we do receive this kind of action, then I want to return a new state where the cart is empty. Now for this, we can return the default cart state simply, like this. And of course, therefore, technically, we could also omit this if check. If we do dispatch an action which is not handled by one of our other if checks, we would have returned the default cart state anyways, but doing it like this is a bit more explicit. Now we need to make sure that this clear action can be dispatched, and for this we want to add a new function here, the clear cart handler. where we don't expect any parameters, but dispatch a new card action where the type is set to clear, like this. And now on the context, we need a new function. So in card context.js, I'll prepare it so that we get better auto-completion, the clear card function. And in card provider, on this concrete card context object, which we're constructing, we now need to add this clear card function and point at the clear card handler, like this. And now from inside the card component, we can execute that. So here in card.js, when we submit our order in the submit order handler, once we're done here at the end, I want to use my card context and call clear card to clear the card once we're done submitting. So if we now save this one more time and go back, now if I order here and enter something, if I confirm this, now my card was cleared and it is empty. And of course on Firebase, so on our backend, we see all those orders. Now that is it for this module. Now we're leveraging a backend for fetching our meals and for sending our orders there. We did add a form with validation, which we have to fill out. And we therefore practiced the key concepts and aspects we learned about over the last course sections. Now, of course, there's a lot which you could fine-tune or change. As I mentioned, you can implement more elaborate form validation. You can definitely add more complexity to this project. But my goal with this project here was to dive into the essence of those previous sections so that we practice the core concepts taught in those sections. Again, I can only encourage you to dive deeper, build some custom hooks, experiment with this project, maybe build your own project as well. That's always a great practice to ensure that you get better and better with React. In this course, however, we got so much content and I don't want to waste your time. Therefore, I'll try to find the right balance between diving deep when I introduce a concept and then practicing the core takeaways and the core concepts in practical projects like this. And therefore, let's now move on and let's dive deeper into React.